On my birthday, my nephew stood on the porch, glanced up at my house, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why don't you just tear this dump down?" The words weren't just cruel, they were deliberate. Behind him, two of my neighbors lingered on the sidewalk, pretending to check their phones, but I could hear their muffled chuckles. The kind of laugh that isn't spontaneous but passed around like a secret, rehearsed in someone's kitchen before being thrown into the cold air where it can bruise you in public. I stood there holding a tray of oatmeal cookies I'd baked that morning. They were still warm. I'd thought, foolishly, that maybe this year would be different, that maybe someone would remember this was the day I was born, the day my mother brought me home to this very house. But instead, I stood in my own doorway, wearing the look of someone who's just been told that the years he's lived, the love he's poured, the history he's carried are worthless. It wasn't the first time. Relatives who once ran laughing down these halls now drove by without stopping, shaking their heads at the sagging roof. Old friends, when they spotted me in town, would grin and ask, "Still living in the museum?" And the neighbors, they were the worst. They had a rotating list of nicknames for my home: the haunted shack, the last stop before the landfill, that sad old thing on the corner. They spoke as if the house were a blemish on their perfect street, an eyesore to be pitied. They never noticed the carved banister my father shaped by hand, back when he was still strong enough to hold a chisel for hours. They never noticed the faded wallpaper my wife picked out in the summer of '79, the year we thought our love could outlast anything. They never noticed the pencil marks inside the kitchen doorway, little notches with dates beside them, where we measured our daughter's height every year until she grew taller than her mother. They didn't see the truth because they didn't want to. They wanted clean lines and new paint and soulless perfection. I lived inside a home that breathed, that kept the memory of every voice it had ever heard, every footstep that had ever crossed its floors. They saw rot. I saw roots, and yet I'd be lying if I said their words didn't sometimes follow me into the night. There were evenings when the wind pressed hard against the old windows, when the roof groaned like an old man shifting in his sleep, and I'd wonder if they were right. Maybe I was clinging to something too far gone. Maybe I was the last fool defending a grave. But then my hand would rest on the railing my father carved, or I'd catch the faint smell of my wife's lavender polish in the living room wood, and the doubt would fade. Every crack, every scratch, every uneven board wasn't decay. It was proof that a life had been lived here, that laughter and heartbreak and dinners and arguments had soaked into the walls. They thought it was just a house. They didn't know it was a witness. And witnesses never forget. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please, write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you in your life? If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and share this video. That's how you help us grow and bring you more heartfelt stories every day. Now, let's continue. When my wife passed away, the air in the house changed. The warmth in the walls seemed to dim, and every creak in the floor felt heavier. The laughter that once spilled from the kitchen had been replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. I moved through the rooms like a man walking through a memory, touching the edges of furniture she had chosen, brushing my hand over the curtains she had sewn late into the night, each thread holding a piece of her. This house was not just wood and nails. It was her handwriting on the walls, her taste in every corner, her soul stitched into every seam. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start. At first, they sounded concerned. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, my wife's distant relatives, even a few family friends, all with the same tone, soft, pitying, as if they were doing me a favor. They told me I needed a fresh start, that the house was too big for one person, that it would be healthier for me to let it go. But under their gentle words, I could hear the sharp edge of greed. They didn't want me to heal. They wanted the land, the sale, the money that would come from tearing down what I had built with my own hands. They spoke as if they were giving me a gift, as if selling the only place that had ever truly been mine was an act of kindness. But I knew the truth. They didn't see this home as sacred. They saw it as a number on a check. And the worst part was that some of them had sat at my table, eaten meals my wife cooked, slept under this roof as guests when they had nowhere else to go. They had called it beautiful once. Now they called it a burden. I refused, calmly without raising my voice. I told them the house was staying where it was, and so was I. That was the moment the concern in their voices vanished. The calls grew cold. The visits stopped. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. My decision didn't just keep the house. It cost me pieces of my family. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. Not just because they turned away, but because it proved something I'd been afraid to believe. That their love for me was smaller than their hunger for what I owned. They didn't see the countless nights I had worked double shifts to finish the roof, or the weekends my wife and I spent sanding the floors until our hands ached. They didn't see the life poured into this place. They saw only what they could take from it. I stayed anyway. I stayed because this was the last place where I could still hear her voice if I closed my eyes. I stayed because the garden she planted still bloomed every spring, even without her hands to tend it. I stayed because walking away would mean letting them rewrite the ending of our story, and I wouldn't give them that power. The house became quieter after that, but it also became more mine than it had ever been. Every slammed door from the outside world only made me lock mine tighter. They could call me stubborn. They could call me foolish. They could call me anything they liked, but they could never call this house theirs. Holidays used to mean warmth. Tables crowded with food, chairs pulled closer to fit everyone in, the sound of voices overlapping in the kind of chaos that only feels like home. But in the years after my wife's death, those same gatherings became colder. Not in temperature, but in tone. I began to notice things I'd missed before. Glances exchanged when I spoke, little smirks when I mentioned the house, whispers that stopped the moment I stepped into the room. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Grief can make you suspicious of even kindness. But then I started catching pieces of their conversations. My cousin in the kitchen, telling someone that my old wreck was scaring off buyers in the neighborhood. A neighbor laughing over drinks that my place was one strong wind away from being a pile of firewood. One uncle, always the loudest voice in the room, joked that if I didn't tear the house down soon, the roof would do it for me. The laughter that followed was sharp, mean, and just loud enough for me to hear from the other side of the wall. They spoke as though the house was a disease that could spread, infecting their perfect lawns and polished porches. I could feel their eyes on me whenever I drove home, their judgment in every polite smile that didn't reach their eyes. Some even had the nerve to suggest I sell it before it became a hazard, as if their concern was about safety, and not the fact that my home didn't fit their picture-perfect image of the street. But they didn't understand what they were talking about. They saw the peeling paint. I saw the afternoon my wife and I painted that very wall, getting more paint on ourselves than the siding. They saw the sag in the porch roof. I saw the years we sat there together, watching storms roll in, her hand wrapped in mine. Every flaw they mocked was a memory they'd never earned. And that's why their words never truly touched the heart of the house, only skimmed its surface. Still, the cruelty worked its way under my skin. There's a loneliness in being surrounded by people who see your pride as an embarrassment. And yet, I stayed quiet, let them talk, let them laugh, because I knew something they didn't. One day, the same cracks they mocked would become the very thing others admired. They couldn't see it yet. But the house and I, we were patient. Winter has a way of making silence heavier. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it seeps into your bones. On the coldest nights, I would sit in the armchair by the fireplace, my only company the crackle of burning wood and the long, aching whistle of wind, pressing through the seams of the old windows. The house seemed to shift and sigh with me, its wooden frame settling into the cold, like an old friend pulling a blanket closer. Outside, the world was empty. The street lamps cast long shadows over snow that no one had stepped in. No visitors, no car doors slamming, no laughter spilling out from neighbors' houses. Only the steady rhythm of the storm tapping against the glass. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring into the flames until they blurred, thinking about the nights when my wife would sit opposite me, knitting something for our daughter, humming a tune I never learned the words to. I could almost hear it if I closed my eyes. I knew the world beyond these walls thought I was alone. They thought my evenings were a punishment for refusing to sell, a slow decay into isolation. But what they didn't understand was that this solitude wasn't empty. It was full of echoes that belonged only to me. In the quiet, I could hear the house breathing. In the shadows, I could see her moving through the rooms the way she always had, her presence stitched into every corner. The heat from the fire wasn't the only warmth in the room. There were moments when the wind howled so fiercely, I wondered if the house could take it, if the roof would groan one time too many and give in. But each time, it held. The walls stood firm. And I realized that in some strange way, the house and I were the same, weathered, worn, but still here. We didn't need anyone else to understand us. We understood each other. The truth was, I never felt safer than on those nights, wrapped in the quiet loyalty of this place. While others saw only age and fragility, I felt strength, the kind that doesn't have to prove itself, the kind that endures. And in that, there was a warmth no amount of cold could touch. It was a Tuesday morning in late February, the kind of cold that makes the air feel like glass when you breathe. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, staring at the frost blooming across the edges of the window pane, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Most calls these days were wrong numbers, sales pitches, or family members finding new ways to remind me of what they thought I should do with my house. But something about the sound of the ring, sharp, clear, insistent, made me pick it up. The voice on the other end was young, energetic, almost too polite. He introduced himself as an assistant to a film director. At first I thought I'd misheard. My house and the world of movies didn't belong in the same sentence, but then he said something that made my hand tighten around the receiver. They were looking for a place to shoot scenes for a new film, and my home had come up in their search. He mentioned an old architectural catalog long out of print that featured my house decades ago. He spoke about the woodwork, the unique lines of the roof, the way the front porch seemed to tell a story without a single word being spoken. I remember my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. This place? The same one that had been mocked, pitied, written off as an eyesore. The same walls people crossed the street to avoid looking at. And yet, here was a stranger from a world far beyond my small town telling me it was exactly what they were searching for. As he spoke, I looked around the kitchen. The morning light was spilling through the lace curtains my wife had sewn, dust floating in the air like tiny stars. I saw the marks on the floor where our old table used to stand, the worn edge of the counter where I'd leaned thousands of times. This wasn't just a house. It was a living archive. And now, somehow, people outside these four walls were beginning to see it too. When the call ended, I sat there in the quiet, the dial tone still ringing faintly in my ears. I thought about all the years I'd defended this home without anyone else understanding why. Maybe this was the moment it would finally make sense, not just to me, but to the rest of the world. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift. It was subtle, like the way the air changes before a storm, but it was there, a current running through the house, through me. Maybe this place wasn't just waiting to be remembered. Maybe it was waiting for the right moment to speak for itself. The next morning, I woke to the low hum of engines outside, a sound so out of place on my quiet street that it felt almost unreal. Pulling back the curtain, I saw two white vans parked at the curb, their sides stenciled with the name of the production company. The street, which for years had been empty except for passing cars and the occasional neighbor's dog, now had an air of expectancy. People stepped out of the vans, one after another, their breaths puffing in the winter cold. They carried cases, tripods, cameras, bundles of cables, and rolled mats of what I guessed were lights or backdrops. A few of them looked up at the house, tilting their heads the way a person might look at a painting in a gallery, searching for something beyond the obvious. There was no smirk, no raised eyebrow, no quick glance of judgment. None of the familiar expressions I'd seen on the faces of neighbors, relatives, and passers-by for years. When I opened the door, they didn't barge in. They paused, almost as if they were waiting for permission to cross the threshold. The first to step forward was a young woman with a camera slung across her chest. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached out and let her fingertips brush along the carved banister, tracing every curve and groove as though she could feel the history beneath the varnish. My father's hands had shaped that banister decades ago, his knuckles swollen from work, his eyes steady as he carved the details. Watching her touch it so carefully, it was as if she were shaking hands with him across time. Another member of the crew stopped at the front window. The light was pouring through the lace curtains my wife had sewn, scattering across the wooden floor in long strips of gold and shadow. He crouched to capture it with his camera, moving slightly from side to side until the angle was just right. I realized, standing there in the doorway, that I'd seen that same light every morning for decades, and yet it felt new in their lenses, as though they were showing me my own home for the first time. Then the director stepped inside. He was older than I'd expected, his coat worn, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. He didn't greet me with a handshake or small talk. Instead, he moved through the hallway slowly, looking, pausing, looking again. He took in the slant of the floorboards, the faded wallpaper in the dining room, the scuff marks along the baseboards where our daughter's toys had once collided into the walls. There was no rush, no checklist to tick off. It was as though he were trying to listen to something the house itself might say. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to me and it wasn't loud. His voice was low, almost reverent. "This is perfect," he said. "This house has a soul." I felt something shift in my chest at those words. For years I'd been told the house was a burden, an eyesore, a leftover from a past best forgotten. And here was a man from a world far beyond my own, looking at these same walls and seeing what I had always seen. Not just a structure, but a living witness. The crew began to spread out, taking photographs of the staircase, the kitchen, the upstairs hallway. They knelt to study the grain of the wood, adjusted their cameras to capture the curve of the archway between the living and dining rooms, angled their shots so the morning light could spill exactly where it wanted to. No one commented on the peeling paint or the worn rugs. They weren't here to judge flaws. They were here to honor details. And the house seemed to notice. The way the sun came through the windows felt warmer, more generous. The faint creak in the floor sounded softer, like a greeting. The air itself felt different, lighter, more awake. As if these strangers, without knowing it, had given the old place permission to stand a little taller. I stood in the corner of the room watching them work, feeling a strange mixture of pride and relief. For so long I'd been the only one who defended this place. Now it didn't need my defense. It was speaking for itself, in beams of light and quiet textures, in the weight of its silence and the depth of its shadows. And for the first time in years I thought, maybe they will finally see what I've known all along. By the second day, the quiet rhythm of my street was gone. The rumble of engines, the thud of heavy cases being set on the ground, the metallic clink of light stands being unfolded, all of it echoed between the houses like a strange kind of music. The vans came early, their doors sliding open to reveal more equipment, more crew members, more signs that something important was happening here. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. Curtains that had stayed closed for years were suddenly cracked open, just wide enough for eyes to peek through. Porch doors eased shut with careful clicks after someone had stepped out to take a better look. Across the street, Mrs. Donnelly, who once told me my house was one hard rain away from collapse, stood on her front steps with a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, her gaze fixed on the activity in my yard. Even the ones who had been the loudest in their criticism found excuses to be outside. Lawns were suddenly being swept clean of leaves, mailboxes checked twice in an hour, dogs walked back and forth along the same stretch of sidewalk. Their eyes followed the crew as they carried lighting rigs inside, or rolled cables neatly along the driveway, or positioned cameras to test angles in the front yard. The same people who had once shaken their heads at my stubbornness now stood rooted in place, watching as my house, the one they had dismissed as useless, became the center of attention. There was a different tone in the air now, something sharper than simple curiosity. They didn't just want to know what was happening, they wanted to understand why it was happening here. How had this place, this supposed blemish on their picture-perfect neighborhood, suddenly turned into a destination worth visiting? I saw their eyes moving over the porch columns, the roof line, the worn wood of the door, as if they were trying to see what the crew saw. From my spot near the doorway, I caught glimpses of their faces when they thought no one was looking. The slight frown of confusion, the quick flicker of something that might have been regret. And perhaps most telling of all, not one of them made a joke anymore. The mockery that had been so easy, so casual, had been replaced by silence. The house seemed to stand taller under their gaze. The details they'd once overlooked, the curve of the banister, the warmth of the front windows in morning light, were now drawing them in, though they'd never admit it. I knew they were rehearsing new stories in their heads, rewriting their memories to make it sound as though they had always appreciated it. But the truth was simple. Only now, when strangers had arrived to value what they had dismissed, did they dare to see it differently. And I stood there saying nothing, letting them watch. Because this time the house didn't need defending. It was speaking for itself, louder than their whispers ever had. By the third morning, the house was no longer just a location. It was alive with a quiet, deliberate energy. I woke to the sound of footsteps moving with care across the porch, the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of equipment being set into place. When I stepped into the living room, the crew was already arranging chairs, shifting small tables, positioning cameras with the precision of surgeons preparing an operating room. And then the actors arrived. They didn't come in with the loud confidence I expected from people used to being the center of attention. They moved slowly, eyes drifting up to the ceilings, across the walls, as if taking in the weight of what surrounded them. One of them ran a hand along the edge of the mantelpiece, the same mantel where my wife once set the clock she loved so much, the one that ticked softly through every winter night. Another paused in the doorway between the living and dining rooms, looking through the old stained glass window that separated the two. I remembered the day I had installed that glass. It wasn't anything fancy, just a piece I'd found at an estate sale. But the colors, deep amber, muted green, soft crimson, had caught the light in a way that reminded me of autumn leaves. My wife had stood beside me, holding the frame steady while I fitted it into place. Now, decades later, the morning sun was streaming through it, just as it had back then, scattering warm fragments of color across the actors' faces and the old hardwood floor. They began to rehearse, the room filled with voices, not loud, but deliberate, carrying words written by someone who had never set foot in this house, yet somehow seemed to understand the kind of stories it could hold. The camera crew moved around them like shadows, adjusting angles, catching the way the light hit a cheekbone, or the way the colors from the stained glass shifted with each movement. At one point, I heard one of the crew whisper almost to himself, "It's like a time machine." His words hung in the air, and I understood exactly what he meant, because as I stood there, it didn't feel like we were in the present anymore. It felt as though the house had folded the years back on themselves, revealing not just this moment, but all the moments that had come before. The laughter of dinner parties, the quiet talks by the fire, the rustle of our daughter's small footsteps rushing down the hallway. I stayed in the corner, unnoticed, watching them capture something I had been trying to protect for decades. They didn't need to force it, didn't need to create it. It was already here, in the way the dust caught the light, in the uneven shine of the floorboards, in the air itself. And for the first time in years, I felt that someone else could see the house the way I did. Not as a place to be measured or judged, but as a keeper of moments that could never be rebuilt once lost. Outside, I could sense the neighbors still watching from behind their curtains, but in here, their voices and their mockery felt miles away. The house had drawn its own audience now, and it was telling its story without a single word from me. On the third day of filming, the house had settled into its new rhythm. Early morning footsteps across the porch, the low hum of conversation in the hallway, the soft metallic click of cameras being adjusted. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when I saw a car pull up that didn't belong to the crew. It was spotless, polished to a shine that didn't belong to this street in winter. And when the doors opened, I recognized the faces instantly. They were family, or at least they used to be. Cousins and in-laws who had, years ago, stopped returning my calls, who hadn't stepped foot inside this house since the day they told me to sell it and start fresh. They were the ones who looked away at holidays, who walked past me at the grocery store as if we were strangers. Yet here they were now, stepping carefully over the icy walkway, their coats buttoned tight, smiles already forming before they reached the porch. When I opened the door, the smiles widened, but there was something behind them, a hesitation, an awkwardness they tried to mask. They spoke in that too bright tone people use when they're trying to rewrite history. Words like, "We always knew this place was special," floated in the air, as if I'd forget the years of silence, the letters unanswered, the birthday cards that never came. They glanced past me into the living room, where the crew was setting up for another scene, their eyes darting from the cameras to the stained glass window to the ornate woodwork they had once called outdated. It was strange watching them look at the house now. Before, they had seen nothing but what they could take from it, the land, the money, the quick profit. Now they saw value in a different currency, recognition, attention, the quiet prestige of being connected to something that others wanted. They weren't here for me. They were here for the story that was unfolding within these walls, the story they had once turned their backs on. I let them speak, let them walk through the hallway, their eyes moving slowly over details they had ignored before. They lingered by the carved banister, touched the frame of the stained glass, glanced at the mantel as if searching for something to compliment. But I could feel it. The undercurrent of regret, the unspoken awareness that they had misjudged both the house and me. The crew barely noticed them, too focused on their work to care about the sudden visitors. And I realized then how different this moment was from the one years ago when these same people had told me to tear it all down. Back then, their words had the power to wound me. Now they meant nothing. The house had already been chosen, already been seen for what it truly was, and no amount of revision in their memories could change the fact that they had walked away when it mattered. They left after a short while, their voices fading down the walkway, their smiles slipping once they thought I couldn't see. I stood at the window and watched them drive off, the polished car disappearing into the curve of the street. And then I turned back to the sound of the cameras, the quiet murmur of the crew, and the steady heartbeat of the house, the only family it had ever needed to keep its story alive. They were filming a quiet scene that afternoon. The house seemed to hold its breath as the actress stepped into the hallway, her movements slow, deliberate, the kind that draws the eye not by force, but by a gravity of presence. She walked past the doorway where I stood, the crew shadowing her with cameras and lights, and as she moved, she reached out and let her fingertips glide along the wall. It was nothing more than a gesture, a small detail in the script, but to me it was like a thread pulled loose in the fabric of time. Because I knew that wall. I knew the exact stretch of it her hand was touching. And in an instant, I wasn't standing in the present anymore. I was back in the summer of our daughter's 7th birthday. The smell of paint had filled the air that day, the windows thrown open to let in the warm breeze. My wife had been kneeling there, her hair tied back with a ribbon, her hand steady as she worked a small brush in careful strokes. She wasn't painting the wall a solid color. She was creating a mural. Tiny flowers curling up from the baseboard, vines weaving their way toward the light switch. Our daughter sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, handing up jars of paint and occasionally adding her own clumsy little daisy to the garden on the wall. Laughter filled the hallway, sunlight poured through the glass, And I remember thinking that if happiness could be captured in a single moment, it would look like this. Standing there now, decades later, watching a stranger's hand trace the same path my wife's had once marked with color, I felt the years dissolve. The soft murmur of the crew faded, replaced in my mind by the echo of my wife's voice telling our daughter to be careful not to drip paint on the carpet, by the little gasp of pride our daughter made when she finished her first perfect flower. I could almost see them both there again, one kneeling, one sitting, their heads close together, sharing a secret smile that belonged only to them. The actress moved on, her scene complete, unaware of the weight she had just brushed against. The cameras clicked off, the director called for a reset, and the crew began to adjust lights for the next shot. But I stayed where I was, my hand now resting on the same place on the wall, feeling the faint ridges of the paint under my fingertips. Some of the flowers were still there, hidden beneath a later coat of color, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It struck me then how the house had been carrying these moments all along, quietly keeping them safe, waiting for the right light, the right gesture, to bring them back into focus. And just for that instant, it wasn't just the memory of my wife and daughter that came alive. It was the reminder that the past never truly leaves, not when the walls themselves remember. It started subtly, like the first cracks in ice when winter begins to loosen its grip. A nod from someone who usually turned away. A smile from a neighbor who had, until recently, only looked at my house with pity. Then came the small conversations. A casual remark at the mailbox. A question shouted across the street about how things were going with the filming. The same people who once treated my stubbornness as a flaw were now curious, almost eager to be near the thing they had mocked. Within a week, the tone had shifted entirely. Invitations began to appear, offered with a practiced lightness. Come over for tea sometime. Tell us about the film crew. Maybe you could bring some behind-the-scenes stories. Some were bolder, asking outright if they might drop by to see the process in action, their voices full of a friendly enthusiasm I'd never heard from them before. It wasn't just curiosity. There was something else behind their sudden warmth, a need to connect themselves to this moment, to the quiet glamour that had settled over my old house. They began using new words, too. Charming, historic, full of character. The very features they'd once dismissed as flaws were now framed as virtues. My sagging porch roof was no longer about to cave in, but beautifully weathered. The creak in my hallway floor was authentic. The peeling paint was a reminder of craftsmanship you just don't see anymore. Their compliments came wrapped in the language of admiration, but I knew it wasn't about the house itself. It was about what the house now represented. I listened, I nodded. I even accepted some of the invitations, but I kept my distance. I had no interest in explaining the magic of the place to people who had never cared to see it before someone else validated it. And yet, watching them try to reframe their history with me, I couldn't help but feel a kind of detached satisfaction. The shift in their voices was proof that the house had done what I never could. It had changed the narrative without speaking a single word. Now, when I walked down the street, their eyes followed me, not with judgment, but with a strange mix of respect and envy. They wanted to be part of the story that had unfolded in my home, to weave themselves into it somehow, as if proximity could rewrite the past. But the truth was, the house already knew who had been here when it mattered, and who had only shown up when the world was watching. The last day of filming began quietly, almost too quietly, as if the house itself understood what was coming. There was no rush, no frantic shuffling of equipment, no raised voices trying to beat a deadline. Instead, the crew moved through the rooms with a kind of reverence, lingering over shots they had already taken, touching the banister, running their hands along the door frames, as if saying their own private goodbyes. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them work. The morning light streamed in through the lace curtains, catching the dust in the air, turning it into a slow snowfall of gold. It was the kind of light my wife used to pause and admire, tilting her head just so, as if memorizing the moment. I thought about how many mornings like this I had stood alone, the air thick with silence, the weight of the years pressing against my chest. And now, for these brief weeks, the silence had been replaced with life again. Voices, footsteps, laughter drifting from room to room. By late afternoon, the equipment began to disappear. Tripods folded, cables coiled, cases carried out to the vans. The house grew emptier with each load, the air changing as the traces of their work faded. I walked into the living room one last time before they finished. The stained glass still caught the sun, painting the floor in fragments of color. It felt like the house was holding on to that light, refusing to let it go just yet. The director found me standing there. He had that same calm presence as the first day he walked through the door, but now his eyes held something deeper, the look of someone who had found more than he expected. He stepped closer, his voice low, as though it belonged to the room and not just to me. "Thank you for keeping this house," he said. "It became the heart of the film." I didn't answer right away. I just let the words settle because they were heavier than they sounded. All the years of being told to let go, of hearing the house described as a burden, an eyesore, a mistake, they all felt like they were dissolving in that moment. The long winters alone, the nights staring into the fire with no one across from me, the empty holidays, none of it had been wasted. Every day I'd stayed had been another day I kept the heart of this place beating, even when no one else could hear it. When the last van pulled away and the street fell silent again, I stood on the porch, my hand resting against the railing my father had carved. The house behind me was still, but not empty. It carried something new now, layered over all the memories, the knowledge that it had been seen, understood, and honored. And as the sun slipped lower in the sky, I realized that this time, the quiet didn't feel lonely at all. The premiere was held in a grand old theater, the kind with velvet seats that seemed to swallow you whole and chandeliers that spilled warm light over the audience. I hadn't been in a place like that in years. The air buzzed with the low murmur of conversations, the shuffle of programs being unfolded, the occasional burst of laughter from somewhere in the crowd. I sat in the middle row, not far from the aisle, my coat folded neatly over my lap. No one around me knew who I was, and I preferred it that way. When the lights dimmed, the chatter softened into silence, and the first frames flickered onto the screen. I felt my heart tighten. It started slowly. A narrow shot of the front porch steps, the curve of the railing, the old wood gleaming under a wash of sunlight. Then came the hallway, the carved banister my father had made, the stained glass glowing like an ember. My house, my home. There it was, larger than life, every familiar line magnified, every imperfection turned into something deliberate, almost sacred. Scene after scene unfolded, and my house was never just a backdrop. It was present in the way the camera lingered on the texture of the walls, in the soft light spilling across the dining room table, in the way sound seemed to deepen when the actors crossed the creaking floorboards. I could hear the faint intake of breath from people around me, as they noticed details I'd lived with for decades. The gentle arch between rooms, the way sunlight shifted through the stained glass in the afternoon. And then, something unexpected happened. Midway through the film, during a quiet moment, the camera caught a wide shot of the living room, empty, still, but full of the kind of presence that can't be staged. It lasted only a few seconds, but when it ended, the theater erupted into soft applause. They were clapping for a scene without dialogue, without movement, without people. They were clapping for the house. I sat there in the dark, my hands resting loosely together, and I felt a slow smile spread across my face. Not the smile of someone taking victory over old critics, not even the satisfaction of being proven right. It was quieter than that, deeper. It was the feeling of watching something you've loved for so long finally be understood by strangers who had never walked its halls. By the time the credits rolled and the lights rose again, my heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. People were talking about the film, about the acting, the story, but I caught snippets too about that beautiful house, about how it felt like a character in itself. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the crowd pass. the last echoes of applause fading like the final note of a song. When I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, I carried with me the quiet knowledge that the world had seen my home, not as an oddity, not as a relic, but as something worth remembering. And in that moment, the years of solitude felt like nothing more than the waiting before the curtain finally rose. When I returned home that night, the street was silent again, the kind of deep quiet that only comes after midnight. The theater's warm glow and the hum of the crowd felt far away, like something that had happened in another lifetime. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, and the familiar scent of the house wrapped around me instantly. Aged wood, a faint trace of dust, the lingering ghost of the lavender polish my wife once used on the furniture. It was the same scent I'd breathed for decades, but somehow it felt different now. The floors creaked under my weight as I crossed the hallway, the same creaks that had once been a reminder of age and wear. Tonight they sounded like greetings, the cracks in the plaster, the worn edges of the baseboards, the scuffs on the doors. They were still there, unchanged, but their meaning had shifted. They were no longer marks of neglect in the eyes of the world. They were proof of survival, of years endured without surrender. I walked into the living room and stood in the center, letting my eyes travel over everything as though I were seeing it for the first time. The stained glass caught the faint light from the street lamp outside, scattering muted colors across the floorboards. I thought of how those colors had glowed on the theater screen, magnified and admired by hundreds of strangers, each one touched in some way by the same light I had lived with every day. There was no applause here, no murmurs of praise, no one to point out the beauty of what surrounded me. But I didn't need them anymore. The validation I had carried home from the premiere wasn't for the world to hear. It was for me, and for the house that had waited patiently to be seen. We had stood together through years of mockery, of absence, of empty winters, and now, even in this stillness, we both knew we had been vindicated. I moved to the fireplace and rested my hand on the mantel, my fingers brushing the faint grooves in the wood where my wife's wedding ring had left tiny marks as she leaned there during conversations. I could almost hear her voice again, see her smile in the flicker of the shadows. The house didn't feel lonely tonight. It felt like a place that had been fought for and won. When I finally climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the boards groaned beneath me. But instead of feeling the weight of years, I felt the strength of them, the imperfections, the quirks, the stubborn endurance of this place. They were no longer just part of its story. They were my victory, carved into every beam and brick, a quiet testament to the truth I had always known. Some things are worth holding on to, no matter how long it takes for the world to understand why. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if even the seasons were reluctant to leave behind the winter that had changed everything. The snow receded from the yard in ragged patches, revealing the stubborn green shoots of the tulips my wife had planted decades ago. The air carried that damp, earthy scent that always came just before the first warm days, and with it came something else. A folded newspaper, left neatly on my porch by the morning delivery boy. I almost didn't notice the headline at first. It wasn't until I set the paper down on the kitchen table, next to my coffee, that the words caught my eye. Old House becomes a movie star. Beneath it was a photo of my home, bathed in sunlight, the stained glass glowing in the window, the porch steps worn but steady. The article spoke about its timeless character, its unpolished authenticity, and the way it had stolen the spotlight on screen. My name was mentioned briefly, just enough to acknowledge the man who had preserved a piece of living history. It didn't take long for the ripple to spread through the neighborhood. Within days, I noticed the change. People who had once avoided eye contact now waved when they drove by. Neighbors leaned over their fences to tell visiting friends, "That's the house from the movie." Mrs. Donnelly, who had once called it a hazard, now boasted loudly to anyone who would listen that she had watched it all happen from across the street. Children on their way home from school slowed down to glance at it, their backpacks bouncing as they whispered to each other. The street that had once carried the weight of mockery now carried pride. They saw my house differently, and in some ways they saw me differently too. But I knew better than to confuse this with true understanding. Their pride wasn't born from the years the house had stood against their judgment. It was born from the moment the world told them it was worth admiring. And yet, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth. Justice, I realized, was not in their applause, nor in the articles, nor in the fact that my house had become a landmark. Justice was in every night I sat alone by the fire, hearing their laughter outside, and refusing to let it take root in my heart. Justice was in every choice to keep the porch standing, to repair the windows instead of replacing them, to keep the flowers blooming in the same soil my wife had tended. Justice was in never once doubting the worth of what I loved, even when no one else could see it. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch steps with the paper folded beside me, a breeze carried the faint scent of lilacs from the bushes just starting to bud. I looked at the house, the worn railings, the uneven boards, the light catching in the glass, and felt the same quiet certainty I'd had the day I first decided not to sell. The applause would fade, the article would be forgotten, but the house and I would remain side by side, with the kind of victory that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. Because the truest justice is not in being celebrated. It is in knowing from the very beginning that you were right to hold on.